So a couple of weeks ago, I went to see the new, good but slightly scrappy modern dress production of Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, starring Matt Smith in the West End. You are probably familiar with this title. You may even be familiar with the play itself. It gets revived a lot. It is written in the 1880s in Norway, and it is set in the 1880s in Norway in a small prosperous spa town, noted for its healing natural waters, and very much dependent on the income provided by visitors to the spa. Anyway, one day the town doctor discovers that chemicals from the local leather tanning plant have gotten into the groundwater and are polluting the healing waters of the spa and making the guests ill. Realizing that he has to do something about it, he alerts the authorities ignore him. So he writes an article for the newspapers expressing his concerns. The editor refuses to print it, and so this town doctor calls a meeting and invites all the townspeople in order to tell them this vital information that they really need to hear. And the people turn on him and drive him out of the town. Because I guess the point that Ibsen's trying to make is when the truth is that inconvenient, it's not the point that the powers that be don't want the people to know. The people don't want to know. Now that plot sounds fairly familiar to you. Try this. Switch out the 1880s for the 1970s, exchange Norwegian spa town for New England holiday island, swap out the spas for the beaches, and switch out the chemicals from the tanning plant to massive shark and local doctor for police chief. Yeah, it's the plot of Jaws. And Peter Benchley, who wrote the original novel of Jaws, was very open about this, that at least the first two-thirds of that book are essentially a reworking of An Enemy of the People. One might even argue that the last act of the book, and indeed movie, while Benchley very obviously intended it as a bit of a Moby Dick pastiche, still carries that theme of rejection of awkward truth. A thing that ultimately dooms Quint and almost the other guys on the boat is his absolute determination to hunt the shark on his own terms, even after it's become apparent, in the immortal words of Chief Brody, that you're gonna need a bigger boat. Not only does Quint not pay any attention to this, he then smashes the radio when Brody tries to call ashore for help, because Quint is so determined to hunt the shark his way. Because I don't know, maybe if he kills the biggest shark in the water, he'll stop having nightmares about the Indianapolis. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up now. But yeah, Jaws is not really about the shark, it's about the people. That's what makes it an interesting film. It's not the size of the shark, it's the reactions of the people to the situation of the shark. So I thought I'd do a video about films that aren't about what people tend to think they're about. And I usually do these in groups of 5. So there you go. Jaws was number 1. Number 2, this one comes up a lot and indeed has been the object of discussion online just recently, Starship Troopers. Starship Troopers is at once both the perfect sort of Dunning-Kruger test film, i.e. only certain people are smart enough to figure out what that film's actually doing. But it kind of has its both ways in that if you are not smart enough to figure out what this movie is actually about, then screw it, it's a perfectly fun soldiers v insects movie anyway. But of course, what this film is an outrageous satire on fascism, which, intriguingly, its source novel really wasn't. Robert Heinlein's book Starship Troopers, on which the film is quite haphazardly based, is, like the film, set in a regimented, militarized future Earth. But it's one which the author depicts in almost entirely approving terms. Heinlein basically appears to have been of the opinion that there wasn't anything wrong with the human race that a couple of years in the army wouldn't sort out. But certainly when the screenwriter Ed Neumeier gets hold of it, and absolutely when the director Paul Verhoeven gets hold of it, the decision is made essentially not to in any way repudiate the fascism of the book, but to, if anything, crank it up to 11 and depict it in such ridiculously glowing terms, almost everybody instantly got that this was a satire. I say instantly. We were all reminded of this about a fortnight ago when some poor soul on Twitter, yes, I'm going to call it Twitter till I die, Elon, opined that he keeps reading that Starship Troopers is a satire on fascism, but how can it be when the heroes are all so good looking, so we're obviously supposed to be on their side? You've just told me in one sentence that you don't know what satire is, or indeed what fascism is. The director Paul Verhoeven, having grown up under Nazi occupation in Holland, was particularly keen to add to the canon of comedy Nazis. This is actually one of the subtlest and cleverest ones we've ever had. Because what we're seeing here is this society as it sees itself. we're watching a movie with a completely unreliable narrator, because this is the film that they would make about this war. And of course, on the second or third watch, you do suddenly realise that you have only the movie's word for it, that the bugs weren't just completely minding their own business until we started slaughtering them. So yeah, Starship Troopers, a deeply, deeply clever movie that only really stupid people don't get. But of course, the screenwriter Ed Neumeier and the director Paul Verhoeven had form in this, which leads us to our next film, RoboCop. Now, a couple of videos ago, I opined that one of the reasons that I still don't think there's been a definitive Judge Dredd movie is I don't think either the 1995 Sylvester Stallone one or the 2012 Carl Urban one really get the sense of humour of the Judge Dredd comic books. Part of the problem with this is RoboCop absolutely got the sense of humour of the Judge Dredd comic books. The Judge Dredd comics were a massive influence on RoboCop. Check out some early designs for the RoboCop armour if you don't believe me. But I remember reading somewhere that the creator of Judge Dredd, John Wagner's idea for Mega City 1, the future society in which it's set, is, what if everything that's stupid about America just keeps getting stupider for about another 150 years? Now, RoboCop dials that down to something like 30 or 40 years, but it's the same principle. Everything that was disgusting about America in the 1980s has just gotten more disgusting as the decades have gone on. And in particular, where Starship Troopers would be the ultimate satire on militaristic fascism, RoboCop is a brilliant satire on corporate fascism. So rather than some kind of self-mythologizing military class taking over the state and reconfiguring it in its own image, which is what you get in Starship Troopers, and indeed what you got in the 1930s. Corporate fascism, what you have is the wealthy elite, the business class, the boss class, the financial sector buying up the mechanism of state, so that civic institutions which were supposed to serve the needs of the people rapidly become just more and more private enterprises to generate more and more profits for the bosses. That's why the jumping off point for RoboCop is the fact that the Detroit Police Department is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Omni Consumer Products, who have been given the franchise by the city to run the cops. A publicly owned civic utility being defunded to the point of collapse, at which point it has to be sold off to private enterprise for profit. Boy, I'm glad that kind of thing doesn't happen in the real world, aren't you? So yeah, RoboCop is, on the one hand, about a copper who gets all his bits and pieces blasted off and gets resurrected in a titanium suit. But it's actually a satire on the kind of society that would facilitate this sort of thing. Perhaps the most telling scene in the whole film is in that protracted kind of digital dream sequence where you're seeing Officer Murphy's gradual transformation into RoboCop from his point of view as he fleetingly regains consciousness in various states of disrepair. There's a scene where one of Officer Murphy's doctors comes in and announces cheerfully to Bob Morton, the magnificently revolting young executive in charge of the whole program, that good news, we've saved his left arm. And Bob's like, the fuck do you mean you've saved his left arm? We agreed on replacing all his body parts. And one of Bob's guys goes, are we allowed to do that? And another of Bob's guys looks at a bit of paper and goes, well, he signed the release forms, he joined the force, he is technically dead, that makes him OCP property, we can do what we like. Yeah, cut his fucking arm off. Blackly funny, but also tells you everything you need to know about a society which is being run entirely in the interest of the corporate class. A similar kind of reading is possible of Ghostbusters. Now, yes, Ghostbusters is on the one hand about a bunch of wacky scientist pals trying to stop New York being taken over by supernatural entities. But I recently saw this rather nice little cartoon strip. If I can find out who it's by or where it was originally published, I'll put a link to it in the description, in which it's made clear that Ghostbusters is basically actually about entrepreneurial capitalism. Because what you have is a bunch of parapsychologists who, realizing there is no future in publicly funded parapsychology, go into the private sector. And much of the rest of the film concerns itself with starting up this business. It's about renting the fire station. It's about buying the ambulance. It's about hiring Ernie Hudson. And then, of course, it's about falling foul of the health and safety guy, played by good old William, patron saint of the 1980s assholes Atherton, who makes them switch all the machines off and flood New York with ghosts. So on the one hand, it is about Gozer the Destroyer. On the other hand, it's about the travails of the small businessman. Before I go to number 5, quick dishonourable mention while we're here. Love Actually. I'm not going to lay into it again. One day I may do a full video explaining all the things that are wrong with this movie, but that would take so much time because literally everything is wrong with this movie. But of course, one of the things that's wrong with it is the title. Love Actually is about stalking. It's about workplace sexual harassment. It's about fat shaming. It's about political recklessness. It's about sociopathy. It's about pretty much everything except love. But this is a Mitch Ben video, so you knew Blade Runner was going to be in here somewhere, and yes it is. Blade Runner, if you watch the 1982 version, which is the only one that's any bloody good, but again, that's a video for another time, is not telling the story that it tells you it's telling, and it's only really when you get to the end of it, and maybe only have to see it 2 or 3 times, that you realise that you're seeing the story from the point of view of the bad guys. Harrison Ford is not the good guy. Whether you think he's human or replicant, he's not a fucking replicant. Whether you think he's human or replicant, he's not the hero. He's just the protagonist. He is, essentially, a guy who murders runaway slaves for a living. Meanwhile, the runaway slaves are just trying to get a bit of an extension on this ridiculously short lifespan they've been given. If there's a hero in this film, it's not Deckard, it's Roy. Roy is kind of android Spartacus, or he wants to be. We are given to understand that Roy and pals did some quite slaughtery things on their way back to Earth. Again, we don't actually get to see any of that. The only people we see coming to a bad end at the hands, in one case quite literally, of Roy and his pals, have kind of got it coming. They're part of this futuristic slave trade. All Roy wanted was to be a real boy. At the end of the film, Roy has Deckard, who I'll remind you, has just shot his girlfriend, completely at his mercy. Not only does he not kill him, he actually saves him when he falls off the roof, just because he doesn't want to die alone. And so, if you like, the theme of Blade Runner, as I've said before, is about a human being who has lost his humanity, who gets it back through his dealings with machines who are desperate to be human. Unless, of course, you watch the later cuts, in which case they're about a malfunctioning android with a unicorn fixation. Oh, for fuck. So there you go. 5 films that aren't about what you thought they were about. You may have thought of some yourself. Into the comments with them. See you soon.
Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please hit like and share. If you'd like to see more, please hit subscribe. And if you'd like to help me make more, please visit patreon.com/MitchBen.